Okay, hey, good morning, everybody. First, a quick announcement. I don't see any of our fellows here, but our fellow team of Kevin Buda, Michael Downey, and Jimmy Evers won the fellow Jeopardy this weekend at the Minnesota ACC, and so will be representing us at the national meeting. So, congratulations to those guys. So this morning's lecture not necessarily will help us with our board exams or research or anything, but in my mind helps us remember why we're doing this despite all the pressure otherwise. So I want to thank the sponsors, AstraZeneca and Bristol Myers Squibb. My pleasure to welcome Todd Warner, my good friend and colleague for many years. He's an internist at Abbott Northwestern General Medical Associates. He's the site director for outpatient education for the residents. He also is the preceptor for the med school rotation and an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. He lectures on medicine literature and is offering the med school rotation, which they did not have when I was there, Wisdom of Literature in the Time of the Plague, as part of the med school curriculum. He's going to be lecturing at the University of Lisbon in Portugal this coming year. He won the Primary Care Community Faculty Teaching Award and the Humanism in Medicine Award. He's an adjunct professor at St. John's, where he also teaches a class, The Art of Healing. He's a writer, published in the New York Post, National Review, several other journals. He's an editor of a journal and runs a podcast. Importantly, he's also a husband, father, and I'm just so happy to have you here again, Todd.
Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great, thank you. For all of you who are here, thank you for being here in person. For all of you who are online, because I know we are in the digital age, thank you for being here as well. Kevin, thank you for our longtime friendship and for this great opportunity. It's an honor to work with MHI Foundation, with all of you fellow faculty, mentors, friends, and the many fellows that I've gotten to know over time. This is seemingly not quite a boards-oriented talk. But hopefully you can pass the boards of life when you listen to a talk like this and kind of rediscover a little bit about that original spark that got you to go into medicine to begin with. So the title of the talk is The Literary Physician, How Timeless Literature Can Revive the Vocation of Medicine. And I want to start off with a story that puts us all back, at least puts me back, into the early years of my life when a classroom, a fourth grade classroom, looked something like this. And this is not the exact classroom, but somewhat reminiscent. We didn't have the big stove in the middle of the class. Miss Stuffy was my fourth grade teacher at Jefferson Elementary School in Mason City, Iowa. And she was my first friend in Mason City because we had just moved there. I knew nobody. I was petrified going to this new school. I loved her. She was tough. She was fair. She was an advocate. And she had this big gray shock of hair, bright red lipstick. I mean, she seemed impossibly old to me. She was probably 50 or 51. And I loved Miss Duffy because there were so many things I learned about her and I loved her style, except one day Miss Duffy assigned the entire class to memorize Robert Frost Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and we were charged to come and to speak in front of the class, recite it 2 weeks down the road. And suddenly my love for Miss Duffy started to wane. So what happened is in the next 2 weeks, I found myself standing by my father's lazy boy, stumbling and fumbling my way through this 16-line poem, 4 stanzas, asking myself, why on earth is a fourth grader new to the school having to stand up in front of everybody and recite a poem about a man who basically rides into the woods, stops for a minute, and then rides on? And so the appointed day came, and 26 different heads would bop out of their L-shaped chair and recite the poem and then sit down. The next person would go up. And it came up to me, and all I know is I stood up, and I had sweat trickling down the back of my neck, and my hands were kind of feverishly pumping, and I believe I fell into some sort of a fugue. And then when I was kind of done, I sat down and I realized the kid behind me stood up. I apparently had done it. I hadn't lost consciousness. I do not ever have to read Robert Frost again, much less recite him. I'm not a poetry guy. It was determined there in fourth grade, okay? But I wanted you, if you have not read Robert Frost Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, I just want you to see it and I want you to hear it. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now, at fourth grade, I had no idea what this meant, but I was a third-year resident on a brutal moonlighting night. I had admitted 3. They were sick as dogs. It's 2 in the morning. I had 4 or 5 more. I don't think we had caps at that time. I was sitting at station 30 at the nurse's station. I had 4 pages that had been going off all night. And I'm in that dim antiseptic light and you just the funk and smell of station 30 at the time, at that moment. And it got quiet. I was waiting for a urologist to call me. And you know if you're calling urology at 2 in the morning, it's a bad sign. So I'm sitting there waiting for a urology to call me. My pages are silent. No one's tapping me on the shoulder. I have to wait. And what should invade my consciousness but stopping by woods on a snowy evening? And for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant. Because at that moment, I was that guy. I was away from home. I was thinking about my wife for a moment because I had to move on to other things. I knew that I had to get the work done. I envied a little bit people being home in bed. But I knew I had miles to go before I sleep and promises to keep. But in that moment, I could still relish a moment, a simple moment of pristine peace. Many people say, why do we read the dead writers? What's the point? And T.S. Eliot had a pretty sharp response to them. He said, people say the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did. And then Eliot corrects him and says, precisely, and they are that which we know. The reason why we know so much now is we stand on the shoulders of great minds and the wisdom that came with those minds. You might be wondering, why is Bob Dylan at an MHI Foundation talk? I'm going to explain. Besides the fact that Dr. Cummings was an inveterate Dylan fan, many of you may know that Bob Dylan won the 2016 Nobel Prize in Literature, and he was even surprised by this. The Nobel committee waited for him to respond, and they waited. And they waited. And a month passed with $1 million waiting to be awarded, and Dylan is not responding in his mercurial way. Until finally he did respond, thanking them graciously, and he offered a speech, never went in person, but he offered a speech remotely. And he explained that part of his delay was to ask what do his lyrics and what does writing folk music in the way he did have to do with a Nobel Prize in Literature. And he said he started to discover it the more he thought about it, because he remembers when he was exploring folk literature to become a true master of the craft, he was listening to Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee and the New Lost City Ramblers, and he was immersing himself in the lingo and the language. And in his speech, Dylan said, I had all the vernacular down. I knew the rhetoric. None of it went over my head. The devices, the techniques, the secrets, the mysteries, and I knew all the deserted roads that it traveled on too. I could make it all connect and move with the current of the day. When I started writing my own songs, the folk lingo was the only vocabulary I knew, and I used it. You might say, well, that makes sense. But here's what surprised everybody. He went on to say, but I had something else as well. I had principles and sensibilities, an informed view of the world, and I had that for a while, learned it all in grammar school. Don Quixote, Ivanhoe, Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, Tale of Two Cities, all the rest. Typical grammar school reading, which, by the way, that's really pretty advanced grammar school, right? I mean, my kids are reading pretty advanced stuff, but I'm like, this wasn't going on in 7th grade. Typical grammar school reading that gave you a way of looking at life, of understanding human nature, a standard to measure things by. I took all that with me when I started composing lyrics, and the themes from those books worked their way into many of my songs, either knowingly or unintentionally. I wanted to write songs unlike anything anybody ever heard, and these themes were fundamental. So these great works of literature that just covered the waterfront of what it means to be human sunk into his marrow. And in sinking into his marrow, they came into his songs, which made the lyrics explode with color. So what did all this literature truly teach Bob Dylan? I would say it's wisdom about the human narrative. Wisdom that we all experience, wisdom we all live, wisdom we all get distracted from by the workaday world, by the cares of the day. Great stories, timeless literature, it gets into our bone marrow. Not just literature style and smarts, but it's wisdom. Wisdom about what it means to be human that transcends culture, geography, language, and time. Many of you might know George Steiner. George Steiner was an essayist for the New Yorker and a relatively well-known literary critic. In the 1940s, at 11 years old, he escaped Nazi encroachment of France. And as the hateful menace drew ever nearer, Steiner recalled, "One of the things my father taught me was always have your bags packed." And this meant more than your physical possessions. It spoke acutely to the preservation of the stories and memories, the beliefs and the morals that make up who you are. That's why Steiner was so intent on memorizing. Memorize a poem, memorize a quote, memorize a stanza, commit it to memory. He said, most of present schooling is organized amnesia. By the way, one of my friends in undergrad said to me, he was going into mechanical engineering. He was no slouch, but he said, you know, Todd, you're going to forget more in your life than I'm ever going to learn. Think about all the sheer volume of information we take in, and then we kind of put it on the test, and a certain fraction of that is kept. So Steiner's putting his finger on this. Most of present schooling is organized amnesia. It takes away the arts of remembrance. Leaves people very little inner ballast. Ballast, like in a boat. You know, the bottom side of a boat used to be filled with gravel and rocks, so it stayed upright in the midst of the waves, right? We need ballast. He says, now, if we don't have the inner ballast, that's fine when all is going well. When all is going well and you're beautiful and young and earning a lot, you can sail very lightly before the wind, but be careful. When things start going wrong, health, loneliness, the most natural of things, what you carry inside you, they can't take away from you. Put the luggage inside. It's the only way I can express it, so that when the wind starts blowing very hard, you have ballast. We're taking that away from our young, and we're leaving them very often tremendously empty. And when Steiner considered the disappearance of the great writers in the Soviet nightmare, he reminded that their work is remembered today because they were memorized in the darkness. As long as 10 people know a poem, he wrote, it will live. We must learn some things by heart. Steiner said the most important tribute any human being can pay to a poem or a piece of prose he or she really loves is to learn it by heart. Not by brain, but by heart. What you know by heart, the bastards cannot touch. They cannot take it away from you. Jerry Saul Morrison's a professor of literature at Northwestern. Mike and I have had a chance to have dinner with him and just become friends with him. Brilliant guy. He says this, there is an obvious proof that great novelists knew more about human psychology than any social scientist who ever lived. If psychologists, sociologists, or economists understood people as well as George Eliot or Tolstoy did, they could create portraits of people as believable as Middlemarch's Dorothea Brooke or Anna Karenina. But no social scientist ever comes close. Still more important, many disciplines may teach that we ought to empathize with others, but these disciplines do not involve actual practice in empathy. Great literature does. And in that respect, its study remains unique among university-taught subjects. He concludes saying, when you read a great novel, you put yourself in the place of the hero or heroine. You feel her difficulties from within. You regret her bad choices. Momentarily, they become your bad choices. You wince, you suffer, you have to put the book down for a while. When Anna Karenina does the wrong thing, you may see what is wrong, and yet recognize that you might well have done the same thing. You might well have made the same mistake. And so page by page, you constantly verify the old maxim, there but for the grace of God go I. No set of doctrines is as important for ethical behavior as that direct sensation of being in the other person's place. I like to say to the medical students, there's two ways to really care about somebody. Sitting across from there and fundamentally giving a damn, and reading great literature, because you're forced into someone's shoes when you read great literature. The other part, when you're sitting on the computer and you're answering your pager and all this stuff, that's hard. But we're called to sit across from somebody and give a damn about them, and practice on the side by reading great literature. Chesterton would say our plight is this: we men and women are all in the same boat upon a stormy sea. We owe to each other a terrible and tragic loyalty. So halfway through my second year of medical school, I began, as my sister would describe it, drying out. He said, you're drying out. I was not happy with that, but she was onto something. Everything was becoming more technical and less human. Efficiency eclipsed intentionality. Equanimity blotted out empathy. The how was overtaking the why. My dad, in his usual salty bit of wisdom, said I was trying to put 10 pounds of manure in a 5-pound can. I don't think he said manure. And then I started to ask, why are you putting manure in a can? And he moved me on to something else. I was sort of in this little burnout phase, right? Walker Percy is a Southern novelist. He's written a number of works, The Moviegoer, Love in the Ruins, and others. He put his finger onto something in one of his particular books. There's a book called The Moviegoer, and there's a character named Bink Spalling. And Bink Spalling is living this life of sort of passively moving along. He's successful enough, well employed, kind of in and out of relationships and so on. But it's this listless existence of crushing what he calls everydayness. And he discovers when he's in the Korean War and he gets shot and he's lying on the ground and he sees this little dung beetle crawling by him and he feels the wind. And it's just this pristine, albeit odd moment to have an epiphany. But he recognizes there's this gnawing compulsion at that moment that he dubs the search. What is the nature of the search, you ask, says Bink Spalling in The Moviegoer. The search is what anyone would undertake if he were not sunk in the everydayness of his own life. To become aware of the possibility of the search was to be onto something. Not to be onto something is to be in despair. In medical school, I found myself pulling out of everydayness right around second year when my sister said, "You're drying out." My dad made his manure comment. I found myself pulling out of everydayness and starting to engage once again on the search. And one of the most notable things I noticed was that my bookshelf in my ramshackle upstairs apartment in medical school was starting to be populated with books like by Jane Austen, or Robert Frost, or William Shakespeare, next to Robin's Pathology, Netter's Anatomy, Rose and Reinke, those books. I started to read great literature again. So what have I discovered or rediscovered on the search? I've discovered a narrative that's easy to forget. It's a human narrative. And we're going to talk about the human narrative in just a second, but before we do, no talk at any grand rounds is ever fully complete from an internist's eyes without at least invoking William Osler once. So as many of you might know, William Osler, the godfather of internal medicine, put Johns Hopkins on the map. And by the way, a much neglected figure, I think, in terms of his style and his ethic of practice. Deeply intentional, had great equanimity, but profound empathy, good efficiency. He wasn't just a diagnostician that we forget about now. He had a cool caring about him that is sort of lost. At least that story about Osler was lost. One of Osler's great quotes that have always stuck with me is, "The good physician treats the disease. The great physician treats the patient who has the disease." It's a big distinction there. In medicine, we trade in humanity. The health and illness of humanity, to be sure, but often also in the oft overlooked human narrative. In the midst of the pagers and the Dr. Blues, the research protocols, the epic charting, arriving early, staying late, we can't escape the person sitting before us. We can't escape the human narrative. It's not just our patients, it's our own. So what exactly is the human narrative? This is my own construct, but it's kind of based on life for me. Dignity, calling, suffering, and grace. Dignity, calling, suffering, and grace. We're going to explore these. So let's shake off our schedules and our plans, our knowledge and our worries, and remember these pristine facts. The person sitting before us is valuable. Period. No matter the circumstance, in their life is an unfolding calling, a purpose into which you as their physician and their health in some fashion fit. They have, are, or will suffer in one form or the other, at one time or another, to one degree or another, and likely many times. And if you are not overly world blind, blinded by the galling efficiencies, the vexing problems, and the nagging distractions, you will see graces in their lives and yours. Unexpected moments of peace and clarity, joy and simplicity that make it all worthwhile. It is this human narrative and the fire that it engenders, the sense that we are to lift another's burden, that informed most of our applications to medical school and our personal statements to get into residency or fellowship, or you're called to go into any other caring profession. I sometimes like to tell my medical students and residents, do you still have that personal statement? which by the way, we all know there's a certain amount of, okay, my daughter's doing apps right now for college. And there's a certain amount of selling yourself. There's a certain amount of integrating your resume in there. But there's also a spark that if all you do is sell yourself and you don't have that fire about who you are and why you want to do what you do, you know it feels flat. We need to go back and read our personal statements and say, where's the fire in the midst of this resume? Now, that said, with respect to this narrative, our training and our careers can form us. They can form us for the good. But be careful because they can deform us as well. So the question we got to ask ourselves is, what will it be? Will we be formed for the good, or will we be deformed for the bad? Now, if we were to be formed for the good, we must remember a few things. First, I like to say again, I reference the medical students and residents a lot because they're the only ones that listen to me anymore, to their chagrin. The practice of medicine is a vocation, not a job. It's a vocation, not a job. And I like to say, if you spent $250,000, which is the going rate now, on top of your undergrad, $250,000, and all this time of your youth, carrying a backpack, eating ramen noodles. I love that. It's like, I know, it's the same. It's almost like post-traumatic. If you're gonna live that life and live in a boxy apartment and so on, and you're gonna do it for a job, I'd like to say, I hope you kept the receipt because you deserve your money back. But if you did it to answer a calling, a fire, that's magic. That's worth it. Sometimes we're like Sisyphus, pushing that stone up, right? Secondly, if we're to be good physicians, we need to be as good as students of human nature as we are of the human body. We are not chemists or anatomists. We are physicians caring for people, human clay, engaging human clay. And thus our lessons will not come solely from Jack or circulation or JAMA or up to date. They will also come from Dostoevsky, Austen, and Frost and Dickinson and Angelou and Shakespeare. Timeless literature can help us rediscover the human narrative and revive the vocation of medicine. So let's talk a little bit about the human narrative. So 2007, I had my first daughter, Annabelle. And like anybody, except mine's special. No, like anybody, it's a miracle. It's magic, right? And I remember coming back after a little time away, and I came back, and my very first patient was Alan, name changed for protecting the innocent. Alan. Alan was a crusty mid-80-year-old guy. He always came with like a herringbone jacket. He wore a vest, nice pair of pants, but he always had food kind of dried up on it, right? His teeth were kind of rotten, bald, a couple wisps of hair kind of going over the top, kind of a cataract eye, shuffled impossibly slowly because he never let anybody touch his arthritic hips. So I would joke that, when Mike and I would go out to dinner or to go out to lunch and Alan would make his way out of the room, by the time he came back an hour later, Alan was just getting to his car, okay? So Alan was the first patient I saw after my daughter was born and I came back. But the other thing I'd say is he swore like a sailor and he always wanted to tell me a joke and it was usually not appropriate. And he thought they were the funniest jokes. And when his daughters would come and they'd try to corral him and keep him on task and so on, he would just say, shut the blank up, I'm telling a joke. And he'd move on to the joke. So this is Alan. Alan, crusty, kind of just rough. And he says, I heard you had a little girl. I said, yeah, I did. He goes, what's her name? I said, Annabelle. And there was something that happened. It was like a light switch went off. And Alan looked off into the distance and he started to say, it was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabelle Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with the love that was more than love, I and my Annabelle Lee. The love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. 7 stanzas more, flawlessly. He quoted Edgar Allan Poe, his famous Haunting. It's a sad poem. I'm like, thanks. It was a sad poem, but it was a beautiful poem from this unexpected person. The shallow waters I'd seen in his body jokes and his foodstuffs on his shirt was suddenly deepened by the fact that there was a reservoir of not just a guy who memorized something, but a guy who liked me and thought that would be a nice tribute. to your daughter. Best gift I got from any patient almost ever. He also once brought me some freezer burned pheasant that he said he had bought, that he had hunted, and I know he had not hunted for 20 years. So that was not his best present. But the best, it was such a glorious moment of the depths of Alan. In her book, A Simple Path, Mother Teresa, now St. Teresa of Calcutta, reflected, the greatest disease in the West today is not tuberculosis or leprosy. It is being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for. We can cure physical diseases with medicine, but the only cure for loneliness, despair, and hopelessness is love. In the last month, many people have walked through our doors, and they have not had anyone ask them how they are, authentically, much less fundamentally give a damn to wait for an answer. People are valuable, period. Sure, they have their odd quirks and their peculiar idiosyncrasies, their maddening habits, their entrenched vices, but they also have an ineradicable worth simply for being. Our patients are people to be accompanied and not simply problems to be solved. Sometimes in the midst of the efficiency of the day, they're a problem to solve. Ever had a patient who made a mistake, had a bad day, or simply for a time was unlikable? Have you ever made a mistake, had a bad day, or simply for a time were unlikable? Ever had a patient who wouldn't change a difficult habit? Ever wake up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror and wonder about how your habit's going? Too often we forget that our patients are human just like we too are human. So these are a few of the poems briefly. I promise not to go way too long, but a few poems for you that I share with my medical students and residents. W.H. Auden speaks about loss. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with the juicy bone. Silence the pianos and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. Let aeroplanes circle moaning overhead, scribbling on the sky the message he is dead. Put great bows around the white necks of the public doves. Let the traffic policemen wear black cotton gloves. He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. The stars are not wanted now. Put out every one. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean, sweep up the wood, for nothing now can ever come to any good. Oh, that's tough on a Monday morning. Ache. Anybody ever seen Dead Poets Society? You'll remember this one, right? But many people don't know. I can't remember if Rob Williams Mr. Keating describes it in there. This is a poem about Lincoln, right? About Lincoln being murdered at the end of the Civil War. And the odd mix of sadness and joy, the joy that the war is over, but that the leader has died in the process. Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near. The bells I hear. The people are exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. The ship is coming in. The crowds are excited. They can't wait to see the captain who's won the battle. But oh, heart, 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 oh, the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. Oh, Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills, for you bouquets and ribboned wreaths, for you the shores are crowding, for you they call the swaying mast, their eager faces turning. Hear, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I with mournful tread walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. Right? And finally, John Donne. This is an excerpt from his work, The Meditations. This is a famous one, right? Hemingway draws the title for one of his books from this, For whom the bell tolls. No man is an island, entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or of thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. The bell would toll in the church to let the people know a death. It's a funeral. It's a funeral mass in many respects. the bell tolls saying a death has happened. But don't ask, who died? Part of us. If one is lost, there's some tragedy in that, right? Why did Auden, Whitman, and Donn write these poems? Why have they endured? Why do we read them? Fundamentally because people matter. These poems are about people that just simply mattered, and they have dignity. So the first part of the human narrative is dignity. Second part is calling. So 4 years ago, I received a grant, and Kevin referenced this. I received a grant from the University of Minnesota Medical School to support a rotation. Everything is disarray. All these medical students, there wasn't enough PPE. Medical students were pulled from their rotations. So they connected with me, and I created a rotation called The Wisdom of Literature in a Time of Plague. Kind of dramatic, right? In it, we read The Plague from Albert Camus. We read a beach read from Michael Crichton, Andromeda Strain. We watch films. We read hosts of poems and essays and excerpts along these themes, right? Calling, duty, dignity, calling, suffering, and grace. Figures that they read will be ranging from Shakespeare to Dante, Jane Austen to Charles Dickens, Winston Churchill to Margaret Chase Smith. But the work that deeply strikes the medical students is Camus' The Plague. If you have not read The Plague ever, read it. But read it now in the wake of what happened with COVID. It's a deep, I mean, it's a little bit of a philosophical treatise, kind of existentialist. So he gets a little bit into the weeds and so on. But it's about a town in North Algeria, French Algeria, North Africa, where basically the bubonic plague reemerges. It quarantines, and a doctor and 3 or 4 other people basically start to figure out what to do. How do you operate? How do you manage life in the midst of this plague and do your duty and so on? And there's all sorts of echoes. Obviously, bubonic plague is terribly worse. Not to minimize the deaths from COVID, but it's terribly worse in terms of its mortality. It was awful. But the long and the short of it is, it's a very striking book. And in this book, by the way, one thing I want to say too is this. When it comes to stories, especially when it comes to suffering, one thing I say to the students a little bit is, suffering, don't get me wrong, but suffering can sometimes become somewhat stereotypical. The drama is how people react to it. The drama is watching the reaction of all the people, all the characters. That's where the story is. The bubonic plague ravages, but after a while, it ravages in much the same way, again and again and again. But it's what people do, how they're formed by this tragedy. That's where the story is. And that's the way it is through all literature. Not necessarily just what happens to a person. It's what do they do in response to that. So there's a character in The Plague named Joseph Grand. And Joseph Grand is this mediocre, middle-aged civil servant who sort of got stuck in a job. He was promised a promotion. The guy who promoted him died, and he never really approached the next person for the promotion he was going to get. He leads a tepid life, never really takes many risks. His wife leaves him, and he just is sort of wing flapping with no flight. And one of the things that he is doing throughout this book is he's trying to write a novel, but he can't get past the first sentence, because the first sentence has to be perfect. So he has pages and pages and pages of one sentence. And he's sharing this story with the doctor, and he basically says, what I really want, doctor, is this. On the day when the manuscript reaches the publisher, I want him to stand up after he's read through it and say to his staff, gentlemen, hats off. Hats off. It's the greatest thing that's ever been written. But in order to say hats off, it's got to be perfect. And so his sentence, and I want you guys just to hear this sentence, if I can find it. One fine morning in the month of May, an elegant young horsewoman might have been seen riding a handsome sorrel mare along the flowery avenues of the Bois de Boulogne. That's his sentence. And he changes commas, and he moves adjectives, and he shrieks at it, and he burns it, and he pulls out of the fire over and over and over again, okay? But here's the thing. When it comes to stepping up and helping the doctor in the plague, he's the first volunteer. He's older, he's kind of ill. He shows up, he helps people get evacuated, he sits by people's bedsides. He's the bravest of them all. And the doctor looks at him and he says, a warm thank you. And Grand looks at him and says, but of course, it's plague. What else would we do? So this guy who's trapped in utter professional mediocrity, utter literary paralysis, when it came to the things that really mattered, he stepped up to the plate and he was the hero. He gets very, very sick, nearly dies. Sorry, spoiler. Nearly dies. Still worth reading. nearly dies. All these things transpire. And at the very end, he and the doctor and by the way, throughout the story, he's talking about his new sentence, hats off. They're going to say hats off constantly. And at the very end, he's standing on the porch about to go into his house. The doctor's about to say goodbye to him. And he says, I think I'm going to give another try at that at my book tonight. I've already written to Jean. He got stuck. He's going to write a letter to his wife. He's already written a letter to Jean to basically reconcile with her. And the last scene of Grand is him taking his hat off like this, right? Hats off. George Bernanot, a great French novelist, said this about the tendency to skirt calling and the tendency to answer it. I believe, in fact, I am certain that many men never give out the whole of themselves, their deepest truth. They live on the surface, and yet so rich is the soil of humanity that even this thin outer layer is able to yield a meager harvest, which gives the illusion of real living. I've heard that during the last year, timid little clerks like Grand could turn out to be real leaders without knowing it. They had it in them, the passion to command. How many men will never have the least idea of what is meant by supernatural heroism, without which there can be no inner life? Therefore, when death has bereft them of all the artificial props with which society provides such people, they will find themselves as they really are, as they were without even knowing it. Horrible, undeveloped monsters, the stumps of men. Awful imagery. But also a characterization of what life is without identifying and answering the calling. Robert Frost was, at his 85th birthday, was described by Lionel Trilling as a terrifying poet, which caused everybody to be very upset. How could you call this warm, pastoral scene old man terrifying? And he said it's because he put his finger on aspects of human nature that most of us, and he dresses it up in farmhouses and birches and mending walls and so on. Come In is an example of that. He says, as I came to the edge of the woods, thrush music, that's a bird, hark. Now, if it was dusk outside, inside it was dark. Too dark in the woods for a bird by sleight of wing to better its perch for the night. Though it still could sing, the last of the light of the sun that had died in the west still lived for one song more in a thrush's breast. Far in the pillared dark, thrush music went, almost like a call to come into the dark and lament. But no, I was out for stars. I would not come in. I meant not even if asked, and I hadn't been. Now, this is a hard one to read fast. But he's a man walking along this edge of the woods and looking deep into the woods, and it's so dark in there. It's menacing. And he can hear a bird singing. He's like, how can a bird sing so beautifully in a place it can't even land or set up a nest? And he came to realize that there's some beings, some people, some things that can thrive in this darkness. But that's not for me. I was out for stars, right? The invitation to answer the dark calling. This is a story that I always think of the story of Maximilian Kolbe, who was a Polish priest in Auschwitz, who when they were standing in line the morning the Nazis are basically having the calling for attention, and there's one person missing, the Nazis would point to 10 people and stick them in the starvation chamber as punishment for that one person being gone. And as the commander was pointing to one person after the other, he comes to a final one, and the man says, my God, I have a wife and children. And Kolbe, the priest, as people recall, stepped out of line, which was certain death, up to the commander, and they said, what do you want, you swine? And he says, I want to take the place of him. So that man got back in line. Kolbe went into the starvation chamber, and for 10 days, he sang hymns, he prayed, he comforted, and he outlived all the rest. And then they injected him and killed him. But there's a little bit of that thrush in the darkness, singing the song, where others might say, I'm out for stars. Rainer Maria Rilke was a German poet. A young man was at this private school in Germany. He was leaning up against a tree, which they used to do, reading a poem. Headmaster walks by and says, oh, I see you're reading Rilke. Rilke used to come to our school. And the boy, this is his hero. And he says, did you know him? Well, yes, of course I did. I should connect the two of you. So they got connected, and they started a series of letters to each other, which got published as Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke. And it's anything but boring. It's advice on how to live a life. And this is a young boy in a hurry. And Rilke is constantly saying, discern your calling, but be patient. He said, allow your verdicts to their own quiet, untroubled development, which like all progress must come from deep within and cannot be forced or accelerated. Everything must be carried to term before it is born. To let every impression and the germ of every feeling come to completion inside, in the dark, in the unsayable, the unconscious, in what is attainable to one's own intellect, to wait with deep humility and patience for the hour when a new clarity is delivered. That alone is to live as an artist. And he says, live the questions for now. And at some appointed time, you'll get the answers. Don't be in such a hurry in your discernment. I had a patient who was going through significant medical problems, but in the midst of that, he had a terrible relationship breakup. He was in a bad place. And we got to talking about everything. And he needed a medication to kind of get him out of this. And he also needed a therapist. And we got to talking about things. And before we left, one thing just dawned on me. I said, have you ever read Dante's Divine Comedy? I said, I'm not trying to, but I was like, you ever read that? He said, no. I said, you should try it. But I said, especially just read the first couple cantos, 100 cantos long. Inferno, Paradise, or Purgatory, Paradise. In the very first line of the very first canto, Dante says, this 13th century Florentine poet, says, midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, where the straightforward pathway had been lost. And Dante, middle-aged, uncertain of where he is, he couldn't turn around because the leopard, the she-wolf, and the lion would devour him. Some people have reasoned bad habits, some sort of metaphor, who knows? But he could see off in the distance where he needed to go, paradise, the mountain. He had no idea how to get there. And who should appear but Virgil? Virgil, the great poet of the Aeneid, his hero. And Virgil looks at Dante and he says, I know where you need to go and I can get you there. But first you have to go through hell. And so they descend down into the Inferno, which is awful. They ascend Mount Purgatory, which is bad enough. And they ultimately arrive at the destination of paradise. And it's sort of like Winston Churchill said, kind of in the heart of the war. He says, if you're going through hell, keep going. Right? There's some people suffering we can't fully eradicate. We can maybe ameliorate or mitigate. We can accompany them. And so this patient went home and he apparently looked at it. And about 2 weeks later, I got a medical message. And he said, I really appreciate the medicine and seeing how it's going. And I made a call for that appointment. But honestly, the best thing you could have done for me was to advise me to read Dante. Because he said, it felt kind of good to know that someone in the 13th century could write something that actually resonated with my own experience, right? So that's a little bit of, sometimes in our suffering we get lost, Dante. Sometimes in our suffering we get paralyzed. Now, the story of Hamlet, briefly, is King and Queen of Denmark, Prince Hamlet. King dies. Within 30 days, the king's brother marries the mom. So Hamlet's grieving his dad's death, but he's also saying, my uncle is now my dad. This is really odd. And then if that's not bad enough, he encounters his father's ghost who says, by the way, your uncle, my brother, killed me. Do something. It was a rough day for Hamlet. And Hamlet spends the first half of the play vacillating to be or not to be. And he's soliloquizing and thinking about all these different, what do I do? And he's upset and he's up and down and so on. A lot of vacillation. He goes abroad, he comes back, and they're digging a grave and there's bones flying from everywhere. And he's like, they're desecrating this grave. And he says, whose grave is this? And they're digging it for Ophelia, Hamlet's girlfriend, which is another shock coming your way, Hamlet. It's a bad week. And these bones are flying out, and he says to the gravedigger, whose grave is this? And he says, it's Yorick's. And it's like a thunderbolt to Hamlet, because Yorick was a jester, the jester under his father's rule, but he was like a father figure to him. Took care of him when his mom and dad were too busy socializing, running the kingdom, and so on. And he says to his friend, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He'd borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rims at it. I'm going to throw up. I feel sick. My gorge rims at it. Here hung those lips that I've kissed I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? To what base uses we may return, Horatio? And in this moment, this memento mori moment, remember that you too shall die, Hamlet changes. He's going to do something. Now, it's a tragedy. Everything kind of ends badly. But he was moved to act, so to speak. Moved out of his paralysis. Sometimes in our suffering, we live with angst. And actually, I'm going to skip this one just out of time. And sometimes in our suffering, we are homesick. The story of Homer, it's really amazing. If you read the Odyssey, if you read it, you're like, how? This is lyrical. This is a lyrical, epic poem written so long ago. And as you might know, Odyssey is the story of homesickness. He's away from his beloved wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. He finds himself exhausted after 10 years of fighting the Trojan War. Then he's shipwrecked, imprisoned, delayed, and detoured time and again. In book 8 of the Odyssey, he's being hosted by a foreign kingdom. He's still trying to get home, and this blind bard named Demodocus plays sweet strains of music while singing about the Trojan War. And they have no idea who Odysseus is. They're singing songs written about Odysseus and the losses that he had, the friendships that had been lost. And as he's doing that, Odysseus starts to weep. And they're like, what's wrong? Is the music not good? Are we making you think of bad memories? And he ultimately unfolds to them his grand story. And they all weep with him, understanding what it means to be homesick. I'm going to finish with grace. I have a patient we'll call James. He's in his 90s. He was a clarinetist for the Minnesota Orchestra. He practices 2.5 hours every day still. I said, James, my first question for you always is, are you still practicing? Because if you're ever not practicing, I'm going to be worrying about you. Every day I'm practicing. He goes, I just can't get it right. Just can't get it right. Played for, decades and decades with the Minnesota Orchestra. Traveled to Europe, all these kind of things. And he says, a couple of years ago, I was driving down the street listening to Minnesota Public Radio, and they're playing Gustav Mahler's First Symphony. And there's a clarinet solo called the Titan that is so sublime, so beautiful. And I was listening to the Titan, and this man playing it, he hit every note right. It was lilting. It was soft. It was gorgeous. And I started to scream at the radio. I started to scream because I've worked all these years to play that well. All these years, 2.5 hours a day, and I can never achieve that level. What is wrong with me? And he's despondent and brooding, and the symphony ends up finishing, and the announcer comes on and says, this is Gustav Mahler's symphony, a rerun played by the Minnesota Orchestra. It was him playing that. I said to him, well, how did you feel when you realized this magical lyrical work was yours? And he says, I felt rather embarrassed, but then I felt pretty good. That was grace for this man. That was grace. King Lear is considered the greatest tragedy of Shakespeare's, but many would say it's the greatest tragedy ever written. And it's a story of a king who's going to divest himself of his kingdom between his 3 daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia, but he wants them to come before the entire court and profess their undying devotion to him. Tell everybody what a great dad he is. Very odd spectacle. And Goneril, Regan, and Regan come out, and they're like, Dad, you're the best. I just love you. I'll do everything. You're awesome, because they want the stuff. But Cordelia, the youngest and the favorite, says, no, I won't do this. And she's like, I love you, but I'm going to love my husband more. I will do anything for you, but it'll be an honorable love for you, not flattery. And he banishes her. And the rest of the play, there's other subplots, but the rest of the play, the 2 daughters that got all the stuff, because they got Cordelia's share, ultimately seek to kill their father. And as he's in the midst of his farthest extremes of and a thunderstorm, shaking his fist at how unjust God is, and he falls into a kind of a sleep or syncope or what have you. He wakes up, and who should be there but his daughter Cordelia. Cordelia landed on her feet. She married the King of France, came back with the French army, and she heard about what the other daughters were doing. She came to rescue her father. And I won't read this because of time, but the long and the short of it is, she asked for her father's blessing, and he says, give me poison. I've done wrong by you. You can never forgive me. You have reason not to love me anymore. And she says, there's no reason I wouldn't love you. I love you regardless. And there's this profound moment of forgiveness, of redemption. The play ends very badly. It's a tragedy, okay? But Lear's changed from that point forward. He's a new person. He's buoyed because all he has now is all he ever wanted, authentic love that he missed. Yeats is the Lake Isle of Innisfree. Briefly, I'll just read this quickly. I will rise and go now and go to Innisfree. Actually, I'm going to stop there for a second. Yeats was a brooding 20-something poet in a dead-end job in Fleet Street, London, bustling, it was 1890. It was bustling, buggies and noise and all this stuff. And his hands are shoved in his pockets, and he's he's out on lunch break, and he's walking down the street, feeling bad about his lot in life. He wants to be a poet, and he's poor. And he basically hears a water wheel tinkling through the plate glass window, and he goes and looks at it, and instantly is transported to his lake cabin in Innisfree. And he composes this poem. I will rise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, where peace comes dropping slow dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evenings full of linnets' wings. I will rise and go now, for always, night and day, I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. On the roadway and the pavement's gray is Fleet Street. It's Station 30. It's the cardiac ICU. It's the road and the pavement's gray. And yet he still sustains himself by the memories of that beautiful cabin that gave him such solace. As I say to people, you all have an Innisfree, and you probably spent more time at that Innisfree in your mind than you ever did physically. It's a solace. Again, for time, read Old Man Traveling. It's a great piece. The human narrative is dignity, calling, suffering, and grace. It's in every work of literature, if you look for it. It's in every patient you see, and it's in you. Dignity, calling, suffering, and grace. How can timeless literature revive the vocation of medicine? By helping us immerse ourselves in stories which are, in fact, the stories of our patients, the stories of ourselves. In hope and loss, suffering and grace, literature's dramas are the dramas of you and me. Literature can fundamentally help us reclaim our humanity by reacquainting us with it. It can awaken us to the ineradicable dignity of our patients and ourselves. It can illuminate the winding, uncertain but thrilling path of calling for our patients and ourselves. In concert with faith and philosophy, it can speak to suffering when our medical measures fall short. And it can arouse us to see grace, the gifts we receive and bestow without merit, so the brilliance of our lives comes into clearer focus. Once again, Gary Saul Morrison helps us understand with an anecdote from Leo Tolstoy. The painter Brulyov, this grand mentor of art, once corrected a student's sketch, just a little bit. The student said, "Why, you only touched a tiny bit, but it is quite a different thing." Brulyov replied, "Art begins where that tiny bit begins." Tolstoy concludes that saying is strikingly true not only of art, but of all of life. One may say that true life begins where the tiny bit begins, where what seems to us minute and infinitely small alterations take place. True life is not lived where great external changes take place, where people move about, clash, fight, and slay one another. It is lived only where these tiny, tiny, infinitesimally small changes occur. And by the way, our patients know this about us. As one of my good mentors and friends would say, our patient knows if we're in the room with them or not in a second. Even if they have an IQ of 70, they know if you care. More than clashing, fighting, and slaying, our days in clinic and hospitals and life in general are filled with little bits. Imperceptible encounters with the human condition, our patients, and our own. So read timeless literature, grow from it, and reclaim your vocation, reclaim yourself, and in the company of the medical care you can provide, allow timeless literature to speak through you to your patients. I conclude with this last slide from T.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Once upon a time, a little fourth grade me stood up in Jefferson Elementary School reciting a poem I didn't understand the importance of it, thanks to Miss Duffy asking me to memorize. At that time, I didn't understand why. I do now. Thank you. Jay.
Thanks so much. That was amazing. Thanks for reviving my high school literature memories. I mean, it was amazing. And I'm wondering if we went 40 years in the future and you gave this talk, if anyone in the room would even know what you're talking about. I mean, I look at what my high school kids, what they are reading in literature. I mean, there's a total assault on Western civilization and literature, claims of, racism, misogyny, or whatever. And I'm just wondering, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll tell you this. The greatest thing for me, and this comes in teaching medical students, teaching residents, teaching undergrads at St. John's, and doing this rotation, is these kids now, they're like, I've never heard this before. And now what I'll say is, they love it. Mm-hmm. They love it. And the reason, I'm not saying I don't get some people that are like, but they what they like is the notion, to my way of thinking, they understand I want to say we've dangerously shifted to the technical, to the antiseptic, to the clinical. And somehow it's sort of like this body we become too reductionist, that we're not looking at the entirety of the person. And these stories, they don't give answers to everything. They unfold the beauty and the wonder and the mystery of it in the midst of the answers we have. And so to some extent, at least what I'm getting back from people in the papers they write for me or the comments they'll give to me is they're appreciating almost a shift from the reductionist view to the total view that speaks not just to body, but speaks to kind of body, mind, soul. And honestly, for me, I did not have great English teachers in high school, and I avoided most English classes in college. I kind of cheated myself. And it wasn't until I was kind of going through a little bit of this burnout phase and I started reading Greek tragedies and Shakespeare and all this stuff. I'm like, this is amazing. This is amazing. And by the way, one last thing I'll say is, I'll open up, sorry. You asked one question, I'd like 4 paragraphs answer. But the one thing I like to say to the students, I said, how many of you read Hamlet in 9th grade? Hands. Romeo and Juliet, hands. Midsummer Night's Dream, hands. And I said, yeah, I did too. I read it, I went to the play, I got an A on the paper, and I had no idea what it was about. Okay? So that's not an insult. It's to say, you just didn't have the life experience or the appetite for it. But you read it and you said, I've done it, I didn't like it, and you never go back to it. But guess what? You read this or watch it when you're a parent, or when you've lost your mom, or when you've seen sick people for X number of years, or you've gone through some trial, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, wait a second, or you're just older, and all of a sudden you're like, this means something deeper. So as one great thinker once said, quick story, this thinker was talking about his high school Father Kennedy, Irish accent, or Irishman, but a Boston accent, loved Shakespeare, and he was teaching at this Jesuit school in New York. And he said, whenever he taught Hamlet, he got on fire. And yet Mahoney, the class clown, was jerking around and didn't like Hamlet, didn't like Shakespeare, and was complaining. And he said, I saw Father Mahoney get this big vein in his head pulsing. His white hair became whiter, his face became red, and he looked at Mahoney and said, with his Boston accent, he said, Mahoney, when you're reading Shakespeare, Shakespeare's not on trial, you are. And the point being that I took away from it is, when we run into difficult works, Dostoevsky's hard, Shakespeare's hard, but maybe it's brilliant and we need to work a little harder at it. And then when you start to actually unfold it, or you have a guide that helps you unfold it, you're like, this is amazing, amazing. And there's no, I would argue it's neglected more in our field, and it's more urgently needed in our field because we trade in human nature with the human body. So really long answer, so thank you for your comment.
Hey, Todd, thanks so much. I mean, this was really fantastic. And so just an announcement, if people want to hear more, on November 14th, we're going to do a happy hour with the fellows at the Global Market. Let me know if you're interested. Todd's going to assign some ratings in advance. But my question is, and I never thought of this, how does this fit into the med school curriculum? Because what I remember from med school is just lots of memorization of, the basic science.
Well, here's the deal. When they come for rotations, Mike and I teach our medical students, and we say there's 2 things we really want to emphasize besides just teach, take care of diabetes, heart failure, all these kind of things. We want to teach them, why are you here, and how do you think? Nothing more than those 2 things, right? And the why are you here is a lot of what I do, which is let's rediscover the vocation of why you're doing this. And the how you think is a lot of Mike's outstanding talks he's given in this forum before. And again, these kids, so in our chalk talks we give every week to these medical students. And then my 4-week rotation I give, people opt for it. And there's a lot of people signing up for it. Now maybe they just think it's an easy one. That's probably what it is. But I hope I'm reeling them in a little bit. So my point is, I think it's a little bit of a niche that we're trying to fill. And all we can say is people are kind of voting with their feet. And yeah, there's another story I'll tell you on the side some other time. But the long and the short is I think it's desired, and I think we've been happy to help to fulfill that desire.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. Well, thank you.